International Center for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma. It's in New York. We are not using PowerPoints, so the way to access it is, of course, www.icmglt, International Center for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma.org. We will all tell you about it later. Why don't we start without my introduction, without me having any further introduction. Part of what you're going to experience here, not only different perspective, the center is not only multi-populations, actually it's for the world, but multidimensional, multidisciplinary, which also means multi-professional.
And we're all associated with it.
Right. Okay, the way the center came about was many years ago, more than I would like to remember. I began with I built the first program to help Nazi Holocaust survivors and their children. This was in the mid-60s, mid-70s. And part of what we learned, their key points was the conspiracy of silence about the Holocaust, which I've written a great deal about, and the multi-generational legacies of trauma. I've written about it. I also came out with a book, the International Handbook of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, that contained over 30 populations around the world of victimized people, traumatized people, and of perpetrators as well. And I thought, okay, the field of trauma is set about multi-generational. In the beginning, in the last decade, I started, with the advent of the internet, I started getting all kinds of emails from all over the world, people wanting to study their own populations and wanted to understand in their own lives how past traumas visited, sometimes on a daily basis. And, but their doctoral dissertation committees would reject their wishes, saying there's no objective measure for this. So they kept writing me that there's no objective measure for this. So I kept writing, I did everything I had to do in the field. You create the measure. But I misunderstood the degree of overwhelmedness in young people today with the field of trauma. When we began, except for good literature, poetry, Bible, etc., there were very few professional books. Today, we can fill this whole room to know breathing capacity with a number of books that emerged since we created the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies in the field of trauma, mushroom. In the last decade, I organized the best researchers in the field, and we created, finally, the Danieli inventory for multi-generational legacies of trauma. So it's a three-part inventory. The child describes the parents and the upbringing. Second part, the child describes him or herself. And the third part is four-generational family history and demographics. And we have already done multicultural comparisons with this instrument. And part of creating the center was to have a home for it, including a home for the data bank that we collect with the numerous languages in which it exists. So we'll be able to compare different populations around the world and see what's unique, what's common, the different cultural issues and how they interact. And the center has grown to be a real center. So it's the International Center for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma. As I always like to do, I like to have the best team in the world, and you'll hear some of the team members speak today. Pablo the Great, who will give the keynote of this conference later, is also on our board. And let's begin. Carla, do you want to be the first speaker?
As you like.
They pretend that I have a say.
She has a great say, as she knows. It's a great pleasure to be here. I suppose one of the aspects which is really important about the center that Dr. Danieli has created is the different perspectives that come into it. So I am going to give some perspectives on trauma and law, and how trauma and the experience of trauma has been dealt with by legal systems. So what I want to comment on are challenges for judges and other actors in the justice system to adequately reflect experiences of trauma and some of the areas in which there's been some progress, limited progress, I would say. It draws on some of my work on cases relating to torture and other international crimes. The first issue that I want to raise, and we don't have so much time, so really I'm going to be putting some issues out there as opposed to really looking at them in depth. But the first issue that I want to raise is challenges in relation to proving the crime. If we start with the definition of torture, the definition of torture focuses on severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental. So clearly, psychological trauma can be the act which constitutes torture. But when we look at the cases, we find that judges tend to undervalue evidence of suffering that is classified fully or mainly as mental or psychological forms of trauma. They also tend to give less weight to evidence from expert evidence from psychologists in cases tend to be given less weight than, let's say, physical medical evidence. Most cases which fall into this category, which can be extremely severe, have been classified as ill treatment as opposed to torture, which then has significant ramifications for the prevention of those types of acts and how they're dealt with generally. Second issue I want to raise is the credibility of witnesses and the impact of trauma on witness testimony. We know that individuals who suffer trauma have difficulty sometimes to come forward to tell their stories because of the challenges they continue to face to speak about traumatic events. But when they do come forward, we also know that the stories are not necessarily ones which they can explain in a linear, clear fashion. Often the most traumatic elements of the story tend to be either underspoken about or overspoken about, depending on the person and the context. We find, and particularly this is quite evident in refugee asylum claims, that the inconsistencies or variability of stories because of the impact of trauma is taken as a sign of lack of credibility when it's actually quite the opposite. The existence of trauma would lend itself precisely to the way in which these individuals come forward and present their stories. One of the areas where there has been some progress is dealing with victims who have been traumatized, the efforts to avoid re-traumatization through the court process. And there has been some progress in this area in terms of allowing individuals to be represented before courts, before criminal courts, caps or ways in which to minimize the impact of cross-examination, which doesn't have a clear purpose in relation to a particular piece of evidence, in order to ensure that the process of justice is not re-traumatizing or further traumatizing for victims who've suffered significant traumatic events. But this is clearly one area where much more work is needed. Another area which I think is quite interesting to note is limitation periods. It's been recognized that persons who suffer trauma will not necessarily come forward straight away with their experiences. So more and more courts are recognizing that when there's a limitation period to bring forward a claim relating to a particular offense, that limitation period might not necessarily need to start straight away, but may start at a later point, or may be extended because of the trauma that individuals have faced. So the fact that courts are recognizing this as a factor is really important. Finally, I want to talk about the issue of reparations. Trauma is something which is taken into account in terms of moral damages. So often courts which make an award of reparations will recognize that a particular individual has suffered and has experienced trauma, and that may be something that will be taken into account, and the importance of psychological rehabilitation. But courts have dealt much less well with the long-term impacts of trauma. For instance, sometimes we don't know at the very beginning after an event what the long-term impacts might be, and if there's a court ruling close to the time of the events, 20 years later, the person's symptoms may be quite different, maybe even more advanced. We know this, for instance, with the Northern Ireland cases, where there was an attempt recently to reclassify the treatment as torture because of the recognition that the impact of the treatment was so bad that it should amount to torture as opposed to other forms of ill treatment. Whilst that failed, the fact that those issues were brought up is really important. And following back onto the topic of multi-generational aspects of trauma, we have much more to learn here, particularly in the area of reparations. Heirs can be beneficiaries with respect to reparations, but we do find that the transmission of trauma to new generations has not yet factored into a part of a reparation claim in the way that it needs to be. So in a way, one isn't recognizing the transmission of trauma to future generations as a particular kind of harm in and of itself. So this is one of the areas where I think there's much more that can be done.
Thanks, Carla. Thanks for the clarity and for leading the discussion to the multi-generational focus. And part of our hope is that the measure that I spoke about will in fact enable us to give objective facts about multi-generational transmission to, for example, the courts. but not only for the courts. Right? Right. Okay. Our next speaker, and this is a round table, right? So each speaker will speak briefly, and then we will have more discussion among the panelists, and of course, most importantly, with you. So André Laperrière, who will sit forever in my heart. He was the first director of the Trust Fund for Victims of the International Criminal Court, which was my dream. And he absolutely fulfilled it in a way. And we remain very close friends since. André will tell you what he will speak about.
Thank you, Yael. I'm not going to speak so much on behalf of my current capacity, so if you want to hear about it, just go to our website. It's called GODAN, godan.info. I'd rather speak more about the Trust Fund for Victims, which is more relevant maybe to this subject. As Yael just mentioned, I had the privilege to be the first executive director of the Trust Fund for Victims, but just a word about it for those who may be less familiar with it. The Trust Fund for Victims was created as a consequence of the Rome Treaty, which is very important, very fundamental in terms of international justice, because it was the first time in the history of international tribunals that in addition to creating an instrument that would prosecute the alleged culprits of war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, there would also be a second component, independent of the first, but that would focus on helping the victims. Because too many times with international tribunals, in fact, victims would say that. They would say, hey, it's nice that you put this murderer in jail, but I'm still in the street, I still have no house, I still have no job, and my family is dead. So that was the spirit that led to the creation of this. So as the first executive director, my role was to establish it, but also to sort of survey or do the landscaping of all the areas under the jurisdiction of the court, the International Criminal Court, identify war victims, and see how to help them retake their place in society. So therefore, the thrust of what I want to share with you today is empowerment. I've had I don't know if it's a privilege, but I spent almost 20 years of my career in conflict or post-conflict environments, from Congo to Iraq and all kinds of other places, and I saw many commonalities there, that some of which I want to share with you. I'm just quoting an example here from the Congo, which is still in a bit of a mess nowadays, but basically what happens in situations like you have in the Congo is that you have a whole bunch of militias or tribal groups that control one part or another of the country for various purposes, economic purposes, because there's diamonds or resources, power, political purposes, you name it. But the way they take this power, they take their place in this scheme is by generating fear and by generating a lot of victims, which will lead to this transmission across generations of this trauma. What they would do typically is that they would identify a village which is not too covered by the army or so, and then at night they would attack it. The simplistic way we see in the media is that sure, they came to kill everyone and steal everything. That's not exactly the philosophy that they use. When they steal everything, it's a bonus. That's not really why they went there. They went there, not even so for the purpose of killing everybody. Part of the purpose is to, of course, remove the population which is theirs because they want to occupy the land, but there's something deeper that they want to do with the population. They don't necessarily aim at killing everyone. They purposely leave some people alive after being tortured, maimed, raped, their family killed, having everything destroyed. So basically you end up with a few survivors carrying bad news to whoever else is there. So when they rejoin the rest of society, people fear them because they mean bad news. They mean fear. They remind them that the rebels are nearby, maybe they can come by, and maybe that one, in fact, why is she alive? She should be dead because everybody else is, so there's something suspicious there. So that adds to the rejection of these victims, which are trying to step back on their feet, but not only have they lost everything, but they become pariah in their own society. So that means that they become totally disenfranchised and powerless, really. And so you end up in major conflicts like the Congo or Iraq or other places, you end up with hundreds of thousands of people like that, which are living in absolute misery. And oftentimes for whose only means to survive is to beg, basically. They survive on generosity of whoever can give them something to eat or something to survive. So to turn that around, donors are in fact sometimes a bit naive in their approach, and I can speak about it. I spent many years with many donor organizations. Sometimes when you have a major conflict like that, you need to act immediately because you have these thousands of people that have nothing to eat, no roof, nothing, so you need to help them immediately. That is fine. But the tendency is to perpetuate that. So it's one thing to get food so that you can eat today, but how about tomorrow? Are you going to wait for more food, or are we going to build up a plan, build up an activity that will allow you to retake your place? And that's the gap that is too often missing, and that's a part that the Trust Fund for Victims was putting a lot of emphasis on. I will give you some example, at least one or two examples that's dear to my heart in the second part of the discussion. But so, I didn't mean to depress everybody with this, but just to say that this is a very serious issue, and to remember this phenomenon of total rejection, the phenomenon of shame. Shame is a word that I've heard many times from many victims like that. Well, you could say, logically speaking, they should not be ashamed. They should feel like they should be helped by everyone. But there's this guilt feeling. Why am I alive? Which others reflect on you. They say, why are you alive? So the whole thing becomes a bit suspicious. So we need to overcome that, so that when the new generation comes up, they don't inherit that, or they don't receive that feeling of shame or guilt or whatever, but rather that they receive a feeling of power, a feeling of being able to rise above and do something. So we'll talk about that later.
Thank you, André. You're reminding me of our work on the Denver case, particularly with the rape victims, who are, as you know, in many of these cases around the world, including in this country, even individual rape victims, not necessarily only massive, in times of war around the world. They're rejected by their own societies, and so are the offspring. And you know that the offspring, particularly offspring of rape, are rejected by both sides. And very few societies have found ways to change this, even though it's been mentioned over and over and over again. So that could be, that phenomenon itself should be for a whole weekend meeting, if not longer. But as you see, we are bringing you through different experiences, so you get somewhat of a wider exposure to this. I just want to quote to you, since Pablo de Grave, the keynote, will be a bit late for this meeting. I want to just to quote to you what he was going to speak about here, so you have his perspective for this roundtable. He was going to explore this single largest epistemic obstacle, as he sees it, to more progress on prevention, which is the siloization of knowledge. And this is true on every panel in this conference, as well as at the UN and everywhere else, unfortunately. He wrote, while over time significant expertise has been accumulated on various aspects of prevention, that is prevention of the multigenerational legacies of trauma, the fragmentation along disciplinary and other lines of prevention efforts have stymied progress. Most discussions about prevention omit reference to history, education altogether, or refer to it in a cursory manner. So please keep that perspective in mind as well. let me give the mic to Professor Roger Clark, who will tell you.
I will take you on a journey, I hope. Bear with me for a moment or two of nostalgia, will you? You're looking at an academic lawyer who last week finished his first 55 years of teaching. I suspect the second 55 years aren't going to be quite as successful as the first 55. But the nostalgia part of it is this. Just over 50 years ago, I was a graduate student just next door at Columbia Law School, and I wrote my doctoral dissertation in the area of human rights. Now, I'm quite proud of saying this. Nobody much was talking about or writing about human rights at that point. Nobody at Columbia Law School taught a course on human rights. The notion of an institute for human rights was at best a gleam in Lou Henkin's eye. But anyway, I wrote a thesis with the catchy title, A United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, which in 1968-69 sounded like a great idea, as so often in life. Alas, I was ahead of my time. The idea created for another 25 years, but hey, it came to pass. And there's a point there that sometimes one has to look at the long term and the way in which life moves glacially. But let me talk a bit about those half century or so since I was at Columbia, and about some of the things I have thought about and which brought me in a strange way to thinking about trauma and its legacies, and to why I was delighted when Dr. Danieli asked me if I'd be one of the board members of the International Center for the Study, Prevention and Treatment of Multigenerational Legacies of trauma. This isn't entirely a chronological account of my intellectual teaching, writing history, but it's more or less. I want to just mention the things I have particularly written about, but obviously also taught about, and at various stages as an NGO agitator, or a member of a UN committee, or representative of government of small Pacific Island states. I have done some work on decolonisation. One doesn't immediately think of decolonisation as an issue of trauma, but my goodness, think some more about it and think about the trauma involved in being colonised in the first place and then being decolonised. It is a multi-generational problem, friends. I have done a lot of work through the Pacific, extended Pacific, never quite sure whether Timor-Leste is actually in the Pacific or the Indian Oceans, but it's about the point where the two meet, at least. Traumatic experience with incompetent Portuguese administration for centuries, followed by an awful Indonesian occupation, and ultimately decolonisation. Terrific trauma there, but they're dealing with it very well. Worked very hard in trying to get the French out of the Pacific. One day they will be gone, but the trauma will remain. We did tolerably well at getting the Americans out of at least parts of the Pacific, the Pacific Islands, but the trauma remains, in particular, the trauma of nuclear weapons, which is a closely related issue when one thinks about the Pacific Islands. The colonial powers, United States, Great Britain and France, tested a total of 315, think about that, 315 nuclear weapons in the Pacific over a 50-year period. One of them that I've written about several times, the Bravo test of 1954, was 1,000 times the might of the weapon that destroyed Hiroshima. Think about that, 1,000 Hiroshimas in one bang. Indeed, the whole notion of decolonization and nuclear testing was dramatically carried out by a very active NGO group that began in Fiji in the 1970s called the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific. Note those connections. Nuclear free, independent, the order in which they come and the connections are there. Let me mention some of the other things that I have written about over the years. Disappearances, trauma, torture, genocide, apartheid, crimes against humanity, indigenous peoples. And in recent times, I've written a lot about the crime of aggression. What could be more traumatic and multi-generational than war and its aftermath? Just one other point I'd like to mention that goes with what Carla had to say, and it is, I believe, Yael, the first time that you and I worked together. In 1984 and 1985, we were tasked by the UN Secretariat with drafting what became a General Assembly resolution in 1985, the Declaration on Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power. It was, I think, a very important statement of the proposition that victims have an interest in the legal process and that one has to think through both procedure and substance in terms of giving victims rights in the process. I'm very happy to note, for example, that significant chunks of that resolution of 1985 found their way into the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It found its way into the United Nations Framework Convention on Transnational Organized Crime and the related protocol dealing with victims of human trafficking. I think, indeed, thinking glacially, one sort of throws out ideas at a relatively high level of abstraction, which at some point move on through. Let's say, think about those areas. I'm sure there are others that I've been involved in more peripherally, got it, over the years that raise these questions of trauma. And I think you can understand how I, as a lawyer, have come to the realization that there is a connective theme there. Trauma is a big part of that. And of course, everyone says it, but it's hard to do it. Interdisciplinary work is really, really important, if not easy. Thanks, Yael.
No, and sometimes, you speak very different languages and you don't find the connecting, but you work at it and you keep working at it. And what comes out is of deep satisfaction. Let me just remind even you that the victim definition in the Universal Declaration, in the
Victims' Declaration.
Right. In the declaration, that the definition of victims includes family members. This is extremely important because, and I take full guilt on that, but it's extremely important for the multi-generational legacies argument because the seed for it is already then. It's 1985. There's one more international instrument on behalf of victims that we have, what's called the Remedy Resolution. Carla, what's the full?
2005, UN Basic Principles on the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of human rights and humanitarian law abuses. And I've even shrunk it.
I know you shrunk it. It's a very long one. It took from 92 to 2005 to to work itself into the books. And sadly, although we were all very happy at the time, I think I'm the only person alive today who was present at the formulation, adoption, and the beginning implementation of all of these instruments. So I would like just
I'm
to
still alive.
rename. You were not in,
Barely, but I'm
no,
alive.
you were not in the remedy resolution. Excuse me. Right. No, but I would like.
She's older than me as well.
Yeah. So now you know that I'm old. You know, that's an. At any rate, I would like for us to remember two of the geniuses who participated as well in creating all of those, including the statute, the victims-related statute in International Criminal Court, and that's Nigel Rodley, who we lost fairly recently, but it feels every day like really painful, and Sharif Bassouni. You may have heard these names. There are a lot of you who are very young here, but I think it's important to remember. Adam.
Thank you. Yeah. So you were promised multiple perspectives, and I think you're definitely getting them. I'm going to maybe try to make some connections between the conversation, the topic of this panel, and the larger topic of the conference, namely prevention, and connect it up to some of the work that we're doing at the International Peace Institute with the goal of maybe looking forward a bit. We're talking historical dialogue, looking back, but maybe we can end this portion of the conversation looking forward. So I'm the vice president at the International Peace Institute, which some of you may know. We're an independent nonprofit located right across from the United Nations, and we work on the broad UN peace and security agenda. We host about 100 different events at our space here in New York every year, and a regular participant in the audience at those discussions is Dr. Yael, Danieli, and I think I am here today and a member of the advisory board of the International Center, in part because of some of the exchanges we've had. Whenever I see Dr. Danieli in the audience, I know I'm going to get a very particular perspective in the Q&A. And that relates largely to the reality that all too often peace and security discussions around the UN really neglect considerations of the multigenerational impact of trauma, in particular when it's caused by conflict. The entire UN system is rings the bell of prevention, is focused on prevention. But all too often it's a reactive form of prevention. The main body meant to maintain international peace and security, as we all know, the UN Security Council has proven really incapable of thinking both historically backwards and long-term in the future, of really thinking holistically about its actions for many, many reasons. There has been, I believe, some progress in recent years. The Security Council and General Assembly resolutions on sustaining peace in 2016 and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development both incorporate a bit more of a holistic understanding of prevention, of conflict prevention, and the entire UN process of reform that is being championed by the Secretary General also makes efforts to move in this direction. But it remains a real challenge to translate this perspective into actual concrete policies on the ground. So I'm interested in really asking the question, what does prevention look like when we take this longer term holistic perspective that can include an incorporation of multi-generational trauma. Yusuf Mahmood at IPI, Peter Coleman here at Columbia, and the folks at the Institute for Economics and Peace tend to frame this kind of question in terms of distinction between negative peace and positive peace. A full understanding of peace, of course, requires a fuller understanding, or rather entails looking at more than just the absence of violence, but a concentration on what it means for a society to flourish. Instead of simply asking what are the root causes, which everyone still at the UN likes to talk about, instead of asking what are the root causes of conflict and how do we stop or prevent them, we need to ask what are the characteristics of a peaceful society and how do we build and sustain them. Many of these characteristics we already know. Peaceful societies tend to have a lot in common, including relative gender equality, inclusive decision-making, intercommunal respect, and lower levels of corruption, for example. But the trick from a policy perspective is to reorient the UN peace-building architecture to take better advantage of such insights. And this requires thinking about conflict prevention as less about security and security apparatus, and more about peace. Yael mentioned this epistemic challenge that Pablo identified of the siloization of knowledge. This actually gets at the core of many of the problems at the UN, where the peace and security and development and human rights pillars are notoriously separated. And this as a problem has been identified for years, and there's reams and reams of paper about the need to connect those silos, but at the working level, they still remain very, very challenging divisions on the ground. Of course, the question of what causes conflict and what sustains peace are not unrelated. This is where I think the question of history becomes very important. We know that one of the great risk factors for conflict and for mass atrocities is a history of past violence. The idea that a past history of violence, however, as a risk factor for future violence is often taken to be evidence of unresolved sociopolitical issues in a society, problematic national narratives, histories of ethnic division or economic or political exclusion that can be manipulated by political entrepreneurs in the future. But something I've learned from my conversations with Dr. Danieli is that, and I think that this conversation highlights, is that the past history of violence must also include an examination of individual trauma and how that is transferred from one generation to another. Actually, I don't know if this is true or not, but it's often said that the victim of child abuse is perhaps at risk of repeating that behavior as adult. Is it worthwhile to ask, is the victim of armed conflict more at risk of perpetuating violence or being a victim of political violence in the future? How does the multi-generational transfer of trauma from armed conflict impact the difficulty of sustaining peace or the likelihood of conflict recurring? And I think in the context of this conversation, that may seem an obvious question, but it's really not one that is asked at the policy level in the UN Peace and Security architecture. I think there's many more people in this room and on this panel that can really delve into that question. But I think it obviously points to the need for a couple of concrete policy areas that I think could be considered. Most obviously, I think it requires the incorporation of the experiences of victims and their long-term care, including mental health care, into our peacemaking and peace-building frameworks. One obvious place is the incorporation of victims' voices in peacemaking processes. both in developing the final outcomes and including distribution of state resources and the focus of policies following. The peace process in Colombia has been praised for the inclusion of victims' voices, although I think on close examination that participation was relatively limited. But one place where I don't think there has been much thinking, and I'll close with this, is thinking about post-conflict exit strategies for peacekeeping operations. And I mention it really because that's UN peacekeeping operations is at the core of the work at IPI. Developing an active prevention policy from a holistic, long-term perspective that can incorporate an awareness of multi-generational issues requires combining and including in conversation both operational tools like peace operations with structural approaches like peace building and sustainable development. And the problem is these are almost always disconnected in some way. This was getting back to that epistemic issue that Pablo mentioned. So IPI is doing some research on looking at the ways in which peacekeeping transitions can be used as a laboratory in some way to help to connect many of these processes. The UN peace operations are currently in a period of drawdown and transition. And it is, in our work, important to understand that when a peacekeeping operation leaves, it doesn't mean the total exit of the international community or the United Nations at large. It often is framed as an exit, but it's not an exit. It's actually a transition to a different kind of presence. For example, in Haiti, the peacekeeping operation transitioned into a special political mission. Cote d'Ivoire into a sort of a regular country team presence with the UNDP and the others. In Liberia, it was a modified country team presence. And too often, the different presences are not in conversation about the different kinds of tools can be used in order to prevent the reoccurrence of conflict in the future. And so understanding how that transition period can be used to incorporate considerations for both the long-term effects of conflict and the necessary infrastructure for sustaining peace in order to avoid the risk of reoccurrence, I think is an important and really regrettably underappreciated question. And part of that will need to be thinking about how issues of multi-generational trauma can be incorporated. I think that would be a very important part of long-term success of these transitions.
I want to just add one more line to this. You know, we often, after massive conflict, talk about lost generations. We actually don't talk enough about it. But, for example, how many of you know what percentage of Syrian kids, refugee kids, get education? Not just Syrian, we can sort of go, you know, that there are over 70 million refugees in the world today. So some of us talk about lost generations. And the multi-generational aspect of it is, how would this lost generation be able to raise kids? Never mind empowerment. Kids who will themselves not be a lost generation. It's a huge challenge. And of course, it is multidimensional, multidisciplinary. Every word you heard us utter. And this doesn't just go in individually. Professionally, I'm a psychologist and a trauma specialist. But for those of you who don't know, some of us psychologists who are also history addicts become psychohistorians. And I often think of the inventory that I described to you is, rather than just writing history in terms of dates, right, and progression as you studied in school, and mostly studied in school, the inventory in our center, our work, focuses on the way people actually live history, right? It's history lived. Just think about it. That's for inspiration. I wonder, we have a fine amount of time, both for the panel to comment on each other's, and of course to have you get into the conversation. So you want to speak first, good. So the audience is taking over. You've had us.
I'll take the microphone.
Okay. How many? Should we collect several questions?
Yes.
Anybody else want to comment, questions, etc.? Thank you. There's 1, 2, 3. 4. There will be many. Try.
Thank you. 2 things. When you have in terms of multi-generational, when you have countries or parts of the world that have been subject to continual mauling, for lack of a better term, such as the Congo since King Leopold, and now it's the plaything of multinationals because of the value of rare earths, so that in addition to everything happening to the people there, you have a poisoning of the entire area. Haiti, which was mentioned, which has had a whole hemisphere plus its former colonial power gang up on it for over 2 centuries, so that they were paying reparations to France until after the Second World War for their freedom. And then the other thing, organizations that have dealt with this, such as HIAS, which, because it had the experience of dealing with traumatized survivors of the concentration camps, was then given the responsibility for dealing with survivors of the Cambodian genocide. So that, and there are other institutions like that. So how does that fit into this picture?
Thank you very much.
Should we take several questions and then, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Then.
Okay, thank you. There's no question. As a criminal lawyer, I am accustomed to read lots of critics, or at least fear, towards a victim-centric approach, which could lead to possible dangers for the criminal trial. But I'm wondering, on the side of the victims, I think the new involvement of the victims, at least at the ICC, has created a lot of expectation in the victim groups. And whereas, from my point of view, in its work, the ICC has remained a criminal court. So I was wondering if you have registered a sort of disappointment of victim group for this brand new role, which was supposed to be something very big on paper, and I think the reality has been something different. I don't know what's their perspective. Thank you.
Don't know what?
The perspective of the victims towards the results.
Several of us will take that. You agree? It's okay.
Hi, I'm Vaishali Dev, and I'm at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia, and also at the Institute for Research on Women at Rutgers. So my question is, I'm currently working on issues of forced impregnation in the Myanmar genocide, and feminists and legal scholars have first brought the issue of the need of separating the language of rape from the language of forced impregnation during the Yugoslavia genocide, and then it went under the radar. And what I have tried various ways to enter the dialogue with the United Nations. They asked for my recommendations, and that was fine. But when I wanted to talk about a convention on forced impregnation, all the walls, there were like really huge walls. So how do we navigate the situation where human rights scholars and practitioners can, really get into the conversation about conventions? And I know this is ambitious, and I have tried several routes through several references, including feminists from the Yugoslavia genocide, but I'm really feeling miserably.
You have answers here, right? we kept this gentleman waiting.
Depending on how you count, there have been like 200 civil
Would you please introduce yourself? I should have asked the previous ones too. It makes it fair to us.
My name is Roy Licklider. I taught at Rutgers and now I'm at Columbia. Depending on how you count, there have been 200 change civil wars since 1945. Of those, maybe 15 are still ongoing. Now, there's some issues about those numbers, but the general pattern is most of these things seem to somehow end. And it seems to me we need to look at the successes pretty seriously and see, is there in fact something being done in these cases to handle this problem of the transmission of trauma to the descendants? Because it's a common problem, but somehow it looks like some societies have done better at handling this than others. And, for practical purposes, that might be a good place to start.
I think that's a thank you. That's a wonderful branch to respond to. Should we start with you?
Okay, thank you very much. These are very good questions from everybody. So I'll leave some space for my colleagues, but I just react to some of the points that were mentioned. One was somebody's question as to whether a child abuse is likely to become an abuser later, and whether there's a parallel with violence and conflicts. There probably is. I'm just thinking of this guy in Liberia soon after the war there, when peace was finally agreed, asking him, okay, do you feel happy that now there's peace, and how are you going to go with it? And he said that he was happy that people would stop killing each other, but as to how to get with it, he said, never. He said, this guy that goes over there, he's the one who killed my wife, but this other one, he's the one who burned my house. I'm never going to sit down with him, and my children will never sit down with him, and their children will never sit down with their children. That's word for word what he said. Hopefully he's changed his mind since, but that's the trend. That's what you see very present. That leads me to my second point, which has to do with the exit strategy. I've been in many countries where there was incoming and exits also, and not always for the better. Oftentimes when peacekeepers come, and I have a lot of respect for them, but they come in a troubled environment, so their main mission really is to stabilize things. So to stop people from killing each other and put in place some kind of quiet pause where diplomats can talk and some peace agreement can be settled. And once that's done, they leave. So, but overcoming trauma doesn't leave when they leave, it stays. So we're talking about empowerment earlier, which is one of the consequences of conflict. When your house has been burned, you don't have any clean clothes, you can barely provide for your only one surviving child, you feel very disempowered, very disenchanted with what is going on. So even if the UN or somebody comes and gives you new coats and maybe a new house even, or some place to stay and some food, it doesn't tackle the internal trauma that you've had. It may give the appearance that, okay, now you're okay, you have a place to stay. But you're still not okay, because there's something inside you that is burning you from inside. And that's something that I've very seldom, if ever, seen discussed in these peacekeeping operations and exit strategy. Part of the problem maybe is simply structural. peacekeepers report to the Security Council, while rebuilding agencies, UNICEF and the others, they deal with ECOSOC. And the link between these two groups, even though we all talk about it, it has not quite materialized the way it should or will in the future, I hope. So if one has to put pressure on something, that should be that, I think. Bridging that gap and incorporating psychological reparations as part of the package, not just economic ones. That's all for now. Yeah.
Okay. Which I don't know.
Yep.
I want to skip into it.
You want?
No, go ahead.
Well, first, actually, another things I want to respond to. But let me focus actually on the comment here from the third row, because I think that's exactly the kind of perspective that
Positive peace.
on positive peace, exactly, and the question of to look at what is successful. Two observations on that. I think that all too often when you look at when questions about victims are being discussed in peace and security realms, there is the assumed sort of division between issues related to peace and justice, and too many people, and often it's described as sort of either sequenced or in conflict. And I think an examination of those contexts in which it seems to have worked, in which the experience of victims has not resulted in a problem, I think is a really important observation. And from a policy perspective, I think it requires kind of flipping the order of where you start looking at these questions. Carla mentioned in terms of the judges that there's a challenge in relation to proving the crime. Prevention policy often has a similar problem in that it's really difficult to point to a policy intervention and say, aha, see, that prevented conflict or that prevented what. But the problem is that those sort of questions start at the policy as opposed to the outcome. So if you start and you look at where in a post-conflict setting actually you have a successful period of peace and sort of work back to based on the characteristics of the society, you can build programming around that instead of starting at the great heroes who came in and did some sort of policy intervention. So I think that's a good observation, but I'll hold on to my other observations.
The questions are really interesting, and I have a whole series of little micro comments in response.
I don't hear you.
Turn on the mic.
Is it on?
It's a good idea.
Did anybody hear what I was saying?
Hello? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. The questions were really interesting, and I had a lot of thoughts in relation to them. Maybe I just start with André's word of empowerment, and just say that there have been studies about the lack of empowerment and the sense of frustration that engenders, having an impact on rates of domestic violence, rates of sexual violence, communal violence. So I would just underscore that. I think further research is needed in different communities about that at the peace building level, but the absence of agency can be one of the catalysts for violence at the local level. The comments about continual conflicts is really interesting, and I think that comes out in how transitional justice policies tend to be looked at as either strong or weak in the extent to which they adequately reflect the different frames of victimization, how the society itself views victimization. For those societies where the transitional justice framework is overly narrow, one finds that those mechanisms are less successful because they don't adequately respond to the needs of the society, which is for the acknowledgement of the different phases of violence. So that's one aspect. I think traditional justice processes because they're naturally going to be much more surgical in how they approach legal interventions, will not be as good, as successful in that respect, because they tend to be narrower. So that's always part of the reason why one has to have different forms of conflict resolution, justice processes, not simply court processes. But even the wider transitional justice policies can themselves be quite limited. On the ICC, your question about victims' role at the ICC and what do victims think, they think all sorts of things, but at the end, I think it's fair to say that victims are not satisfied yet by the ICC process, though the fact that they've been engaged in the criminal process has been positive. The fact that they have expectations, that's the mantra often that's been used to say that the ICC statute, rules of procedure were flawed because now victims have all these unrealistic expectations. But let victims have expectations. That's the starting point. It's the basis upon which we'll get to a place where those expectations will be realized. We're not there yet, but it's a long-term process. On the question of forced impregnation, the issue that you raised, I think there is a good example in the recent work of the International Law Commission on the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, which includes, of course, a definition on crimes against humanity. So there, a number of women's rights advocates, lawyers, people who worked in different tribunals, got together and said, well, it's not all right that the definition of crimes against humanity simply mirrors the definition in the Rome Statute, because that was too limited. And without knowing the detail of whether or not forced impregnation is included specifically, I don't know. But it's an example of how lawyers, activists, etc., got together and actually were able to influence an ongoing treaty development process. And there are other examples of NGOs and activists being involved in treaty development, which I think are really positive. We can also think of the violence against women conventions that have recently been developed at the regional level in Europe, in the Americas, etc. I think I'll end there.
Okay. Let me just catch the tail end of this. There are two hats of mine that don't belong to the discussion today, but do respond to these questions, to some of the questions. We have actually, tomorrow we are reviving the Alliance of NGOs for Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice at the UN. And you're all invited. We meet every 2 months on that Friday, whatever Friday, I will let you know. And we've been extremely successful in lobbying and getting things done with the UN. So I urge you to join us. That's from the point of view of advocacy processes. I want to address another question with the issue of process, which is your question about victims' expectations with the ICC. Carla, like the rest of this panel, is totally humble and didn't mention her new book, her update book on reparations that's coming out in the next few months. And I have an article there, a chapter there on reparative justice, which is a concept I've been developing for the last several years, and looks at justice not only as the outcome, but as the process, and claims that the process of justice for the victims is as important or more important than the outcome. and this is very important, and not only that every moment in the process of justice, and that gets also connected to your question about positive things to talk about, every moment in the relation, and also it looks at victims and justice as a relationship. So that every moment, even from the moment before the victim meets with the system, justice system, even when the victim just dreams about justice, every moment, even before the prosecutor decided who to use or how to go about interviewing, can serve as a healing moment for the victim, as a reparative moment for the victim, or as a re-traumatizing moment for the victim. So I claim that it is in the process that justice gets fulfilled, much more so than in the outcome, and that not only the International Criminal Court, the reason I so much look for the International Criminal Court is because we used to think of it as the beacon for justice for the world, right? That would be the place that would shed light on all the issues and challenges that the world needs to solve in this system. And indeed, I believe that training, even in law schools, is missing as long as process does not come into the discussion. Certainly, all the issues that Carla mentioned before in terms of judges, of all the staff and all of the workers in the justice system. So I wanted to pick on that. With regard to your question about why don't we learn from positive, there are two possibilities here for us to draw from. One is, in the psychology of trauma, we also talk about post-traumatic growth, not just post-traumatic symptomatology and despair, but how has it changed your life, perhaps for the better? Because people sometimes say, you know, it woke me up to issues of morality, or it gave life a particular meaning. Again, in my experience and research, the trauma that leads to that is less massive and less destructive than many of the traumas we touched upon in this discussion. So this is one, but it's as good a question as any. And as Ada mentioned, it's totally related to the notion of positive peace. And Raja, I'm sure you want to.
Thanks.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, let me start with forced pregnancy. Let's try at the macro level, the big picture for a moment. Think about lawmaking in general, if you would. It's a pretty random process. You're never quite sure in domestic law whether you're going to get a statute on your favorite thing or not. It's really hard to do. It's really hard to do it at the international level. Think about crimes against humanity. Justice Jackson basically formulated a notion of crimes against humanity in drafting the Nuremberg Charter. And following Nuremberg, we went off on what I've often thought was an unfortunate tack. We spent a couple of years negotiating a genocide convention, a very poorly drafted piece of criminal legislation in my humble view, but it was probably important to do, even if done badly. But the result of that crimes against humanity, which in much ways were much better developed and better drafted in the Nuremberg Charter, took a back seat. We're now at the point where the International Law Commission, 50-some years later, is having a crack at doing a freestanding crimes against humanity treaty. And Carla's mentioned some of the problems there. Do you take the ground that we've achieved in the Rome Statute, which heaven knows was a really difficult negotiation, or do you go back to the drawing board and try to improve it? Well, 20 years have passed. You can make the case for saying, well, we can do better. We have some jurisprudence. We've learned stuff. We can do better and so on. It's a really tough question. I'm not entirely sure if I were one of the negotiators on the current effort, I would really try to do that to improve on it. But there you go. You can see the problem. You know, we have a treaty on torture, but we don't have a treaty on murder, which is kind of interesting. Came out in the Pinochet case, for example. It's illegal to torture people in Chile on his part. Can be tried in Spain, but he can't be tried in Spain for murdering people in Chile. There's some funny anomalies there in the stuff that we enshrine in legislation. Let me then go to the specifics of it. Bosnia, of course, was an example of forced pregnancy, as indeed was East Timor, which I mentioned before. East Timor, frankly, raised the issue starkly. That was the problem in negotiating the crimes against humanity provisions in the Rome Statute that deal with forced pregnancy, namely the Holy See, because the Pope's position is, and he's right, that at the end of the day, the forced pregnancy issue has an abortion aspect to it, because what happens is you impregnate women, you prevent them from getting health care, which includes abortions. You have to bring the children to a term. Start trying to negotiate that with Catholic countries, and frankly, there's a serious problem. It's interesting that the comment was made about involvement of NGOs and academics and so on in important negotiations of this kind, because the forced pregnancy provisions in the Rome Statute rely almost entirely on the hard work done by the late Rhonda Copeland from the City University of New York and her women's coalition at Rome. Would not have happened without Rhonda, but she was very nearly sandbagged by the Holy See in that particular enterprise. So understand how difficult it was to get it in there. It's been difficult to get down the road of having the prosecutor, the ICC, prosecute some of those cases. I think it's very difficult to imagine that one can get a general treaty at this stage of the game, much as I would be sympathetic to that endeavour. The criminal lawyer at the back. Look, criminal law is tough, and particularly applying criminal law to the kind of situations we're talking about: war crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression, genocide, and the like, because there are other things we could put within the jurisdiction of a court. And there are some trade-offs. That was the first panel this morning on the Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia raised some of these questions, I think, quite starkly. Sometimes we want our panels, our courts, tribunals, to give us an accurate account of history. And that's good. To some extent we can do that, but there are limits, because after all, at the end of the day, we're prosecuting a particular person for his or her involvement in a particular situation, and as a defendant, they're entitled to rights. You know, I'm an old American civil liberties lawyer from way back, and it seems to me individual rights are important. Somehow we've got to do that trade-off, and that same trade-off applies to victims. Now, we've had plenty of experience in domestic criminal law, with starting with the proposition, we've got to make the offender pay. If the offender does awful harm to a victim, the offender will pay. Well, frankly, the offenders in domestic law are not unlike the ones that appear before international tribunals. When you get them in court, they're broke. And the first thing that means is you've got to pay for their defense. And that's right, you should pay for their defense, right? Secondly, if they're broke, they're not going to pay the victims. and it will only be occasionally. And it is true, domestically and international law, only occasionally will you get a defendant who has money. As it happened, B.M. Bagumbo had a lot of money, and his money was seized. At the end of the day, he was acquitted. And I'm not one of those who cavils with the decision of the appellate tribunal. I think they got it right. It was a failure of proof. But of course, if there's a failure of proof and the defendant isn't convicted, then the victims don't get his money, do they? And that's a problem. Let's not oversell. I'm going to finish my time, thank you.
You forgot the last week's development.
Well, but it doesn't help. It doesn't get money to the victims.
It's 400,000 euros to the trust fund for victims.
I understand that there's a contribution there, but in theory, we could have got a lot more money out of by convicting for the big crime rather than for lying and cheating and so forth. But it's only very occasionally that, which is why the Victims Trust Fund is so important. It's why one has to think about some alternative mode of getting money to victims other than getting it out of the perpetrators. Exactly. But no, I agree with you. Sometimes we can get some money out of the system, but obviously not enough. Now, of course, there's another problem. The trust fund relies on the generosity on the generation of funds from the generosity of a handful of decent states, governments, and that's
always cry that they don't have money.
I'm afraid. So those are problems, and one doesn't want to oversell a victim's participation. Yael makes a good case, and I think she's right. It was the right thing to include victims in the Rome Statute, but it would be wrong to oversell what we could do about that. Roy Licklider's question, I had an answer, but Adam did it much more eloquently than I could have. But I have a sort of secondary thought, which is not quite responsive. And that is, I think you're right, we have to do some country studies, better ones that have been done, to figure out what works where. And excuse me. And it got me thinking a bit about some of the work that has indeed been done in Timor-Leste. And I think Timor-Leste is a good example of the half-hearted way in which the world is able to deal with some of these questions. Timor did some prosecutions. They weren't very well done, and they didn't get enough of the top people. They got some of the minor perpetrators and so forth. But frankly, your taxpayers and mine didn't want to pay for it, and we didn't do it properly. Timor had what I think I got this correctly translated from the Portuguese was the group on. So I get the right terms for this reconciliation, reception, because I talk about bringing people back into society, and peace. And they did a study, and I don't know that it was properly funded, and I don't know that it's well done. But there are a lot of things like that one can do, and what one has to think through, I think, what are the right things to do in those situations. I mean, it seems to me peace commissions and trials are useful things to do, along with a lot of other things, but one has to think through just how successful they are in achieving those exercises. Well, that's enough.
Thank you.
Yes, I wanted to add 3 points basically pertaining to your question on the victims' frustrations or perception. In my experience, the victims that I've dealt with, they were essentially hoping for 3 things. One is proper reparation, so that they can rebuild their lives and be somewhat compensated for what the harm that they've suffered. Their frustration links to the difficulty there is in doing that. You know, if you're from some small village in the middle of nowhere in Africa, Hague is very far from there. So there's a sense of not being able to reach these big tribunals that are somewhere that maybe ultimately would give something after too long of a period, usually. So that's one frustration. Fortunately, the Trust Fund for Victims is helping. Others are trying to help, but there's a lot more that should be done there. But they're also hoping for a couple more things. One is in general, they acknowledge, especially after the emotion phase has gone down, like immediately after the conflict, everybody's in up and down, so it's not the right moment. But after a little bit of time, then people start to assess the people who harmed them. And then they tend to see them in two categories: the masterminds of the evil. These are the ones that they would like to be put in jail. Not just because it provides them some comfort that they will not go out and do the same again or do it to somebody else. But then, second, they also acknowledge that a lot of the smaller people, be it former child soldiers or others, they are responsible because they were part of that, but they're not responsible to the same level. And they also acknowledge that you can't put all of them in jail, otherwise half the population will be in jail. So that doesn't work. But what they want is that they want these people, as small as they may be in the chain, to acknowledge their wrongdoing. That's why I was glad to hear Roger mention the word reconciliation. There's been all kinds of attempts, sometimes very successful, like in South Africa, sometimes less successful elsewhere. But that's an important element that provides for part of this psychological remedy that we're trying to put in place. The difficult thing with reconciliation is that as much as you and I can talk about it here and see that it makes sense, we cannot artificially and efficiently import it somewhere. It has to come from the people there. So they have themselves to define what the proper reconciliation should be, the way it should proceed, and then carry it on. So this is where NGOs in particular and people, advocates like all of you, play an important role in making sure that this happens.
Thank you. Anybody wants the last sentence?
Well, I just
And why is that
I don't know if this is a wise sentence, but just maybe a looking ahead, just in relationship to your point on education.
Exactly.
And also going back to something that André said, that was striking to me, that how you pointed to that trauma is often created in conflict, not as a byproduct of conflict, but actually as an intentional act, which I think really puts the onus on and responsibility on policy to address it. It's not just something an accident; it's actually something that's intentional. And obviously, I think education for the young has a really important role here to play. At the UN, the youth discourse is extremely live right now, and I think education needs to be more upfront and center as it relates to preventing future conflict. You raised the point about the education of Syrian refugees, and I think one of the fundamental problems there is that most of the refugees are not in the space in which international organizations can come in and educate them. They're not in camps. They're interspersed within the local communities in the region, and they're not being integrated within national level education systems. And it's something to sort of bring the young adults.
Yeah, and that connects to another thing that I learned, for example, in the Central African Republic, that as long as the kids are not afforded, I'm talking about the second generation, are not afforded education, they don't have food to eat, they have very little help, and they simply join the militia. So this is another way of repeating the cycle of violence, and how education can be an intervener in between. Another value of our website, the one I gave you, I'll give it to you again, is that we are accumulating a library of everything that was ever written in the area, including of literature, including Bible, as I said, including poetry, not only psychology and not only history and not only law and not etc., but all together, and of films, plays, theater, etc. Let me repeat the center's website. Again, it's www.ICMGLT, International Center for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma.org. We are eminently accessible. We would help in any way for research, literature, whatever, and we are really looking forward to more and more participants. So thank you very much. And just one more positive word. Research. I'm back to being a psychologist. When we had the inventory in English, and at the same time as I was researching North American children of Nazi Holocaust survivors and their children, I researched Israeli children of Nazi Holocaust survivors and their children. And we found very interesting, significant differences. On the whole, the Israelis did better than the North American, even though, for example, economically, the Americans do, on the average, better. So even the measure of success is a whole other cultural issue that we don't have time to go into. But our analysis at the time was, knowing that trauma is a rupture in the continuity of life, of individuals, families, communities, neighborhoods, nations, recreating continuity with prior history that has also pride and satisfaction and dignity to it is helpful to healing the rupture. And part of our understanding was that those survivors who went to Israel to build a Jewish state went back to millennia of continuity, to recreate millennia of continuity. And so that life there is more meaningful. Because in both places you started a new life. But just to have life for money doesn't seem to do the trick. And by the way, that's also part of your answer for the victim's expectation. Just the money simply doesn't do the trick. I remember a Rwandan kid who was a head of a household, a 12-year-old, saying, and I quote him in that chapter, he said, "We go to get the reparations money in the bank. It's the only adult they see per month." Okay? And she said, she doesn't even ask how we are. So it's not only the matter of getting the check, it's the whole context of the relationship. And with that, let's expect our missing panelists to give an amazing keynote.